Now today, of course, it's a great honor and privilege to welcome one of our own, Dr. Dorothy Zukor, the Associate Director, Earth Sciences Division at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and now an Emeritus since March of 2019. Dr. Zukor wanted to work for NASA when she was young, and when she saw the first rocket going to space. She was inspired by the Apollo program and aspired to be an astronaut, a dream that almost came true when in September of 1989, listen to this, September of 1989, she was selected as a semi-finalist for the NASA's astronaut class of 1990. An amazing feat she rarely talks about. Let's give her a round of applause. Good job, good job, good job, good job, good job. Who would have imagined, of all people? So today, she's going to talk about her own journey from childhood to now, entitled No does not mean never. It only means not now. She's going to describe several U-turns in a tunnel she took chasing her dream and key moments in a long career at NASA for more than 3 decades. One of our landmark accomplishments that I want to highlight as the Deputy Director of the Earth Sciences Directorate from 1993 to 1994 includes the design and construction of the Earth System Science Building, this building we are sitting in, which houses most of the center's earth scientists to help encourage cross-disciplinary collaboration and ensure scientific missions are accomplished successfully. She represented our division on the Center Level Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which helped to change demographics at Goddard, and served as the center's mentoring and coaching champion. She advocated for family life issues, such as the establishment of the lactation stations, the first on a government facility that would help early career women to maintain their jobs while growing their own families. On a personal level, her unwavering support of the Maniac Talk series enabled this to last for more than 80 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our speaker, Dr. Zukor.
This is a Rorschach splotch, so you can make of it whatever you want. These are my parents, Ted and Thelma Zuker. I was born in 1950 in Baltimore as an only child. I was born in a neighborhood where a lot of kids had already grown up, so they were high school, college, or gone. So I spent a lot of time alone. So in addition to being an only child, I was alone in the neighborhood. So we all got very close. One of my closest buddies, and those of you that know me well know I love dogs, was Jingles. Jingles was my gift for my 5th birthday, and she was my buddy until I was in high school. As Charles said, I was very interested in space. From a very young age. I liked science fiction, I liked TV shows, anything that had rockets, stuff that flew, stuff that went fast, I loved it. When I was little, I guess I was about 9, I told my parents I wanted to work for NASA. And they were stunned. They didn't know what to do. They were like, what? Because not only was it such a new and burgeoning field, they didn't know a whole lot about it, and I was a girl, and girls didn't do that. So, but they had the good sense to stay quiet, and they just said, okay, if that's what you want to do. I liked Star Trek. Star Trek was one of my favorite shows. I have memorabilia from Star Trek because one of the things I liked about it, and I didn't even realize this until I started working on the diversity committees, was that all the different beings, not even races, but beings working together really appealed to me. And the fact that they were exploring and not fighting all the time. I went to Catholic schools in Baltimore. I was a decent student, but not a great student, because everything was memorization at that time. They didn't have the stories. They didn't have some of the projects like they have now. And so I didn't get serious about my studies until I was in the last few grades of grade school, 7th and 8th grade, because they were building a new high school, and it was brand new, and it wasn't as stodgy as some of the older high schools. And so that's where I wanted to go. So I made sure I worked hard so that I could get in. I did get in. We had some excellent teachers, particularly math teachers. I had one math teacher, Sister Joannes, who I told her, I said, you could teach math to a rock. I said, you have every possible explanation to explain some of these concepts to students. So by the time I graduated from high school, I wanted to be a math teacher. That was my goal. Not because I felt cubbyholed, but because that's what I liked. That I would go to college was never a question, just a question of where. And so my father and I talked about this a little bit, and he pretty much decided I would go to the Notre Dame College of Maryland, which is now Notre Dame University. And just to let you millennials know, I didn't have any of the craziness for applications like you folks may have had. None of that. We picked a school, we sent in the transcripts, we sent in the check, and I showed up. That was it. My first course in physics, I was sold. I loved physics. I loved physics and I loved math, and physics put math together. So I was in pig heaven. But the physics department at my school was very, very small. So, and they knew that. They admitted it, because it was a relatively small college. But the school that was across the way, which was within walking distance, had more physics and more higher level math. And they had an agreement with them so that I could go to that school, get credit at Notre Dame, but take the classes there. And that was Loyola, Men's Catholic Jesuit College. I loved Loyola. You could argue with your professors. They gave you these incredibly hard tests, but they would give you hints. So you never really cheated, but you had to keep trying, and you couldn't give up. Plus, they were teaching the men how to support themselves, because they were training them for careers. And I benefited because I also wanted to be able to support myself when I graduated from college. There were 13 of us, 11 guys and 2 girls, me and Sarah. Sarah and I became best friends. My dad knew that I liked math, science, and engineering. He also knew that there weren't many women in the field. So he sat me down. He said, you know, you're going to have to be really good at this. You're not going to be able to just slop your way through. You're going to have to be good at this. You're going to have to work really, really hard. And so he had provided a lot of good guidance to me over the years. And when I was in college, I would have to bring my textbooks home and show them to him, because he wanted to make sure I wasn't taking stuff that I couldn't use. And so he said, you know, you're probably going to have to get an advanced degree so people take you seriously. He said, because if you walk in the room as Dr. Zuker, at least people will know that you're not just there for show. So I had my path plotted out for me way back when. I graduated from Notre Dame with a degree in engineering physics. I was at the top of my class. And I had been dating a gentleman called Larry Ramsey for a couple of years at this point. I had met him at a neighborhood swimming pool that my parents joined when I was about 9 years old, but I didn't meet him until I was in middle school. During the summer of 1972, he proposed to me, which totally flabbergasted me, because I said, how's this going to work? I love you, but how's this going to work? I'm headed to the University of Illinois with a teaching assistantship, which I have no intention of giving up. And you're working in Cumberland for the state of Maryland in the Department of Natural Resources. So after a lot of negotiation, we're like, okay, we'll make this work. Our parents were stunned. They were totally confused. They were like, this isn't the way it's normally done. It just isn't the way it's normally done. So we were engaged in September. We got married the day after Christmas in 1972. And then he went back to Cumberland, and I went back to the University of Illinois. Our honeymoon was in Disney World over Easter break. I entered the freshman class of physics students at the University of Illinois. There were about 100 of us, 3 women. They were not terribly welcoming. They didn't really want us there, and it was more than once where I had a fellow graduate student pretty much invite me out. But I was like, I'm here for the same reason you're here. I'm here to study physics. I'm here to get my master's and my doctorate. So sorry if you don't like it. The problem was the space program was winding down at that point. It was the early 70s. And even the top students in the class were having trouble finding jobs in their fields. I was struggling because at that point I realized that despite my excellent grades in college, I was academically unprepared for that school. I mean, this was one of the top physics schools in the country, and I just didn't have the background to really thrive. So I withdrew, which was very, very difficult for me to do. I was totally bummed out for about a year because I felt like I had to abandon all my dreams. That was the first U-turn in a tunnel. Now this is a tunnel in Norway. I didn't know you could build tunnels underground like this. This is a roundabout in a tunnel. There's 1, 2, 3 ways you can go around. And this was picture taken out of a bus going probably 40 miles an hour. So I was very lucky to get this picture. But I didn't know you could make a U-turn in a tunnel. But you can. Major engineering feat. So in the meantime, Larry had been they'd asked him if he wanted to come to Annapolis to work. He was working in Cumberland for the state of Maryland. And he said yes, and then I came back to Maryland. And I had a mini semester class in 1971 at Argonne National Lab. It was on radiation physics, and I loved it. It was very, very interesting. So we were sitting there talking, and we finally said, well, why don't you go into engineering? Because you like that class. They're building nuclear power plants. This is something that'll give you what you want. You'll be able to support yourself. So Larry was perfectly willing to support me. That wasn't an issue. He was like, you don't have to do this. But it was something I wanted to do. So I joined the nuclear engineering department at Maryland. It was small, but it was strong, and the professors were very, very supportive. And I thrived there. I loved it. I started out with a teaching assistantship, became a research assistant, and then over the years I got my reactor operator's license because they have a research reactor there. And when my major professor, Dr. Frank Muno, called the NRC to schedule my exam for the reactor operator's license, and he gave him my name, they said, this is a woman. He goes, yeah. He goes, are you sure she's ready? And he says, oh yeah, she's ready, no problem. Because I was one of the first women to get any kind of a reactor's operator's license in the country. I took it. I was teaching classes, I was running labs, I was fixing lab equipment, I was irradiating samples in the reactor. I was in pig heaven. I could have stayed there forever. But Larry had other plans. He says, you don't stay in school forever. I liked it. I thought it was a pretty good idea. So I was a member of the American Nuclear Society, and they had a journal that came out every month or so. And they had job offers, job openings posted in the back. And one evening, we're sitting there looking at this, and he finds one and says, well, the Advisory Committee for Reactor Safeguards is looking for PhDs or almost PhDs to work there for a period of time. He says, why don't you apply? I said, I'm not going to make this. I said, these are famous people. I mean, it's like the head of health physics and radiation at Johns Hopkins. I'm not going to make this. So I threw my hat in the ring. Lo and behold, I received one of the appointments. There were 7 of us. Again, me and 6 guys. But it was a very interesting job. I got to meet some of the people who actually wrote my textbooks, which, how many times in a career do you get to do that? Very, very smart, very intelligent, but my role as a ACRS fellow was basically administrative, to make sure that they had meetings once a month and to make sure they had everything in order, that they had what they needed, they had the references, they had the books and everything else to have their meeting so that they could come in on Friday afternoon, have their meeting, and leave on Sunday morning. So it was not the kind of job that you stayed in forever. So I had to decide, what was I going to do? I couldn't stay there forever because I didn't want my technical skills to erode. So after about a little bit over a year, I went and applied to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to work there in Bethesda full-time. I still, at this point, did not have my doctorate. I was still working on my doctorate because I had figured that I was almost finished, but I found my dissertation in the library when I was checking my references. You have to understand that was not like it is today, where you punch on a reference on the World of Science and it comes up. This was, you had to dig through the journals, you had to basically go into the stacks, which are the old sections, pick out the hard copy and thumb through it and make sure you had it right. And I found my thesis, and I'm like, I can't pass this off as original research, which is the whole purpose of a doctoral thesis, because I found it. So here I was working full-time and having to finish my thesis, which I had never planned to do. I wanted to pretty much finish my thesis and be working. I persevered. I thought about giving up, but I persevered. And I figured, even the degree would help regardless, because I had to learn a lot of different stuff to get my degree in nuclear engineering. You have to learn a little bit of systems engineering, you have to learn a lot of math, you have to learn how turbines work, you have to know how electricity is generated. So there was a whole lot of other stuff that I had accumulated over the years. So I went back, I said to my professor, of course I'm a mess at this point, I'm just panicked. And he says, well, you don't have to start completely over. All you have to do is define a significant variation on your topic, develop that, and finish the dissertation. Because a lot of the preliminary work, a lot of the writing, the verbiage was already done. So I did that. I finally finished, and of course, at this time, I have a lot of relatives, and we have parties, like you had Thanksgiving last week. And, you know, we'd have the family together, and they'd say, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing? And I'd say, I'm getting my doctorate in nuclear engineering. And so at one point, I finally, I'm not saying this anymore. I'm just not saying it. It stops the conversation, and they start arguing with me, and I'm done. I'm just not so. So in 1982, I finally got my degree. I walked, because they said, aren't you going to have a mail-your diploma? I said, no, I worked too hard for this thing. I'm walking. And so at that point, my father, my mother, my husband all saw me graduate for my doctorate. And these were the three people that stood, and my in-laws, that stood behind me for many, many years when I went through this. And that was one thing I learned, and I also picked that up again in coaching. If you have a dream, don't let other people talk you out of it. Just hang on there. You don't have to hang around people who don't like your dreams. But by this time, that was the good news. I got the degree. The bad news was by mid-80s, they were canceling nuclear power plants in this country right and left. And so I was like, this is not good, because this is what I want to do. I want to work in this field. So I started looking for a job. I didn't really want to, but I started looking for a job. In January of 1986, Challenger blew up. I was sitting in a restaurant in Bethesda when it came on the TV. I still remember it. And I started, and I'm like, we're done. We're not going to build it, you know, even though I still think nuclear power is the way to go, I don't think it's going to happen. And if it does happen, it's going to happen way beyond my career lifetime. So I started putting out feelers and putting out job applications, telling people I knew that I was looking for a job. Some openings came up at NASA in safety following Challenger. When Chernobyl blew up in 1986, I had already had an offer from NASA. I had accepted it, and I was about ready to leave and go in about 2 weeks. And my boss's boss at that time said, did you know something I didn't know? I said, I didn't know anything. This was luck. But I now know that after Chernobyl, we're not building any of these plants, not for a very, very long time. I said, because even though they did a lot of stupid stuff in that plant to make it blow up, you can't explain that to the average person. So besides, people are scared. And when people are really scared, another thing I learned in coaching, you can't reason with people when they're scared because their brain is not functioning properly. So how did I find out about Goddard? We didn't have USA Jobs. We didn't have the internet. A lot of you know I ice skate. My skating coach's husband worked here. He took the ad off of the bulletin board, brought it back, and I applied, and I made it into Code 300 as a payload safety officer for the shuttle in May of 1986. As NASA was getting ready for the shuttle flight, they'd never anticipated a shuttle blowing up on launch. They just never really expected that. And one of the things they had was a visitor's site on Banana Creek where people could watch it. And this is where they took a lot of the VIPs and people that were interested in the agency. Some of the Silver Snoopy Award winners got to go there. But the question now was it safe to put them there? And so there were these two competing interests. One, you really wanted people to be able to see this thing take off because it's very impressive. But two, we also, if we have an accident, we don't want them to get hurt. So I was one of the few people who had had a fair amount of risk assessment training because of the work I'd done in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and I was on an agency team to look at this Banana Creek site. And then I got to work with some of the major players in risk assessment, not only at the NASA, but in the country, and also with some of the senior leadership at NASA. It was really an exciting time. Scary, but an exciting time. And then I went back to At this point, I'd been a payload safety manager for a couple of years, which was a really interesting job, and I enjoyed it. But it was very mechanical in terms of you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. So I had taken a downgrade from a 14 to a 13 to come to NASA, because I really wanted to come to NASA. I mean, as Charles said, that was the goal. So I'm like, I don't care. Larry's working, I'm working, we don't have any children, we can do this. So this was a reliability eye now. Notice the diverse nature of this group. So once again, this was my life. My daughter is working in the engineering field, and she was talking about, Mom, there still aren't a whole lot of women. So when I was putting this talk together, I left this out and showed it to her. I said, you think you were alone? Look at this. So I asked Brian Keegan, who was the head of Code 300 at that point, what could I do to advance my career? Because I liked what I was doing, but I was busy but bored. And so he said, well, there's occasionally something opens up at the headquarters level to do a detail down there so that you can see how the agency runs. And shortly after he mentioned that, the announcement came out, and he encouraged me to apply, which I did. It was called the Assistant Executive Officer to the NASA Administrator, also known as the horseholder position. The horseholder being the administrator. So your job was to follow the administrator down. You were like his shadow practically. And make sure he had what he needed for his meetings, make sure all the details were taken care of, made sure that the right people were in the meeting and that they weren't, as their substitutes were there. It was a very administrative type job. It was very interesting though, because you were looking at the leadership of NASA every day. I went down, I threw my hat in the ring, I got an interview. I applied. I drove down to DC in a snowstorm. I had to get a suit to go for the interview because I didn't have one. And it was a long interview, and I'm sitting there and I'm doing my best, but I'm like, I'm dead. I'm just dead. This guy just likes to talk. So I got home and I said to Larry, I said, it was fun, it was interesting, I enjoyed meeting everyone, it was nice to be on the 9th floor. This was a waste of time. 2 days later, they called me and offered me the position to be the assistant administrator to Dr. Jim Fletcher. I was shocked. I was thrilled, and I was terrified. I hadn't been at NASA very terribly long. I didn't know a whole lot about the agency. And I hope I know enough to do this job. So when I went down to fill out the paperwork, I actually found out that it wasn't really a detail clearly. It was a reassignment to headquarters with the option of being reassigned to Goddard. And at this point, I'm like, well, I'm not giving this up now. I mean, that'd just be crazy. So I went downtown, but at first I had to go for a conversation with the then Center Director, Jack Townsend. And I think you had to interview with him, so he made sure you didn't go down there and embarrass Goddard. So after he finished briefing me, I said, you know, I really probably do want to come back to Goddard because I worked downtown twice during my career all so far, and I don't think I want to work down there again. So he says, well, if you want to come back, call me when your detail is over, and I'll find you a spot. So all I had to do was then pray that he didn't leave in the meantime, which he didn't. So I reported to NASA in the August of 1988 at NASA headquarters. We hit the ground running because it was a return to flight following Challenger. Everybody was nervous. I mean, we were all running around. People were checking stuff they'd never checked before. They were double checking things. We didn't want anything to go wrong. No accidents, no crashes, no nothing. Because the concern was that the agency's reputation was on the line. If another shuttle blew up, we were going to lose the confidence of the American people. We weren't going to have a manned space flight program. And like it or not, that's the rudder that keeps this place going. The manned space flight was what made people follow NASA, for the most part. So it was an exciting time. I sat through an entire flight readiness review, got to see the launch that day and a couple other launches and landings while I was downtown working for the administrator. During this time, I also worked in the White House. I was there for the changeover from the Reagan administration to the George W. Bush administration. One of the weirdest things I ever saw. I had a person that I worked with, a point of contact, And she had told me, she said, a lot of us, since it was Republican to Republican, we assumed that some of these people would stay. But they didn't tell these people whether they were going to stay or not. So my point of contact disappeared one day. Nothing. I didn't even have anybody to ask, who's the replacement. And then a couple months later, like in March, somebody calls and says, I'm your new point of contact. I was able to attend the NASA event for the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11, where George W. Bush talked about going back to the moon, and Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, which are the astronauts that first walked on the moon, were there. And I was fortunate. I was appointed to escort them through the Air and Space Museum while the ceremony was being prepared. And you could not have given me a better prize. These were my childhood heroes. And here I was locked in an elevator with them. So, and then after that, they had a barbecue for the astronauts, and Larry and I were able to go because my contact at the White House said, you worked so hard on this, you got to go. So I didn't fight with her. After the shuttle returned to flight, and we'd had a couple of successful launches, Dr. Fletcher stepped down as NASA administrator. He'd been NASA administrator before, and he said, I answered the call when the president called me. I did my duty as an American, and I've delivered what he needed. Then Admiral Richard Truly took over, and of course, as typical, the leadership wants to pick their own people. So I returned to Goddard, and Jack Townsend gave me a couple options of where I could possibly go, and I interviewed. And I spoke to, he says, they're forming another directorate. And I said, no, I didn't, because of course I'd been all my attention was on headquarters. I said, no. He says, we're forming an Earth Sciences Directorate. So I went and I spoke to Vince Solomonson. And I said, yeah, I'd like to work there. So I became the Associate Director for Projects Engineering for Vince Solomonson when the Earth Sciences Directorate was formed. At that point, his deputy was Bob Price, and the EOS program was just beginning. I mean, there was nothing on it except some papers. And those papers weren't even called EOS yet. They were called the Bretherton Report. When Bob accepted a position at headquarters, I went in and I said to Vince, I'd like to be, because I'd been doing, it'd been one of these things where he'd been doing the job at headquarters already. He'd been absent a lot, so I'd taken his place in a lot of meetings. I'd worked with Vince for a couple of years. I knew we worked well together. So I went in and I threw my hat in the ring. I was like, I don't want to have them put some clod above me that I got to figure out how to work with them. So I'm going to go in and volunteer. So I went in and I said, I'd like to be considered for the position of your deputy. He goes, okay, that's good news. I'm glad. Thank you. Nothing else for a couple of months. They had a search committee. And in the summer of 1992, he selected me as his deputy. And a couple months before that, our daughter, Rosalind, Lindy, had been born. And Vince was thrilled. He was thrilled that I was having a daughter and a child. So he gave me a lot of responsibility over the years. He was great. He treated me with a lot of respect. I was able to sub for him when I needed to and when he needed me. I eventually led the Center Strategic Planning Team under Joe Rothenberg, which I had a blast. And I was able to pick my own team from across the center. And a lot of those people are in leadership positions today or have moved on or retired, but they've all had great careers. I was originally involved with the first Diversity Council when it was started in 2000 under Sharon Wong. And I think I'm the only other charter member, I think, is Dan Krieger. I was the last outside charter member to be here when I retired in March. My husband refers to us as the clones. This is my mother, our daughter, and me. And so every year I try to take a picture of the three of us. One of the goals Larry and I had for our daughter was that she would know how other cultures and how other people lived and that they could do so successfully. So in 2004, we took our first trip. It was to the UK. And we figured that would be an easy one for her because she was young. We wanted her to start going while she was young, and they also spoke English, so we didn't have to deal with the language issue, which we did in later trips. So that wasn't a problem. Larry did German, I did French, and Lindy did Spanish. These are our dogs. We always had shepherds. The one on the lower left is Callisto. The one upper right is Valley. She was my mom's dog, and I adopted her after my mom moved out of her house. And the other one is Trocken, and Trocken was Lindy's personal guardian. And it was very interesting when we had pictures of Lindy somewhere that one of the dogs was always in the picture. We never intended that. We just found that out when we started looking at the pictures years later. In 2015, Lindy got her degree in chemical engineering, so she was the 4th chemical engineer in the family. And then 5 was me, the nuclear engineer, the dark horse in the family. I served, as Charles said, as the directorate point of contact for this building. I got to pick the team, and I didn't necessarily pick senior people. I picked people who were going to be working in this building for a prolonged period of time once it was built, because I didn't want them making decisions for other people that they didn't have to live with. And took almost half of my time while we were designing this building. I had no preconceptions of how it should be built. I just knew I wanted all the scientists together. I wanted it to be quiet. I wanted it to be a place where we could work. If you've never been involved in a building, which I had not been up to this point, and trust me, it changes you for life. In a federal facility, anything can cancel a building. So I had view graphs on my person for probably about 4 years. And I only knew they wouldn't cancel it pretty much after they started putting the floors on. Because when you had a hole in the ground, I was like, no, you can't give up now because they can still cancel it. And I knew once it was canceled, it was gone, even though it may have been on the list of projects that the agency wanted to do. We designed it 3 times. The first time it was a tall building. It was sort of, if any of you have ever seen the Salk Institute, I think it's in La Jolla, tall building, like 9, 10 stories, but it has a lot of labs in it, which was one of the reasons it was considered a model for what we wanted. It's, no, it's too tall. All the rest of the buildings you got it are low. You can't have this monster sitting there. The next one was open space, just open space, a big block with cubicles in it. And I threw a fit. I was like, no, you can't have that. And that was in vogue at the time, because everybody thought everybody could work like that. I go, no, we got procurement people, we got people working competitive proposals, we have managers, and we have budget people. You can't put these people in open offices. So we finally won. We had, this building originally had 5 fingers, not 4, but we had to give up 1 because of the budget. And I also thought you should be able, if you're going to work on the earth and study the earth, you should be able to see it. So that's why we have windows. That's why we have all those windows. And then as Charles said, we were the first building to have a lactation facility. It was a pilot. We had a facility, we had a place you could use at the health unit, but nothing on center. So I worked with EEO and OHCM, and we said, okay, well, we'll try this. And since we hadn't done anything specifically to the building yet, I said, okay, we will put this in the building and we'll use it as a pilot. And now I think almost every building in the center has at least one. And it's run by volunteers. It's not, doesn't cost the government any extra money. It's run by volunteers. The only money the government spends on it is to keep some of the machines and the refrigerator and stuff clean. When Franco Einaudi took over in 2000, I continued to serve as his deputy, and he ran the directorate very differently, so I had some time on my hands. I still had meetings, but I didn't have anywhere near the number I had previously. So the center was starting a mentoring program. And I knew, I sort of thought I could be a decent mentor, but I wanted some help. I wanted to know how you really did it. So they offered a training program, which I took, which Franco certified me for, and he said I could take it. And then after I finished that, I said to the person that was teaching me mentoring, I said, what else? What's next? I love mentoring. Is there anything else? He goes, well, there's coaching. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know squat about coaching. I became a certified coach. Had I known how hard it was going to be for me, I'm not sure I would have done it. Because it was the equivalent of getting a master's degree in an unrelated field. Because most of my classmates were psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, or people that worked in some sort of human resources or personnel office. So to my coaching school, I became, oh, that's the woman from NASA. That's her. That's her. So it took me a little bit longer, but I did finish. And it changed my life. I learned a lot about myself. I became a much better listener. I think I became a better manager. It was just hard. But, you know, other stuff had been hard too, so that was not that big a deal. During Franco's tenure, I formed a civility collaborative and also the 600 diversity team. And for a while, those were separate, and then it became obvious that there were so many similar topics that we discussed that I combined them. Plus, our schedules were all getting crazier, and it was hard to have 2 meetings a month. So we talked, with Joan Wangler, we talked about, and her organization, we talked about emotional intelligence, constructive conversations, having difficult conversations, race relations. We talked about Ferguson when it happened. We talked about gender identity. We had a lot of topics that we interviewed people. We had a lot of topics that were things that people were uncomfortable talking about, but really needed to be spoken about. In February of 2005, Goddard, eventually, not the same year, but previously, headquarters had joined the science directorates, and Goddard followed their lead and combined Earth and Space Sciences. I was slated to go to the planetary division to work as Rich von Drack's deputy. And I'd already started doing interviews of his managers and his people to find out what they wanted to do and, you know, to get to know them and find out what their interests were and how I could help them. And then shortly after that, before I actually moved offices, Franco became ill. And he continued to work from his home in Columbia, but you needed somebody on base. And I went in and I spoke to Nick White, and I said, Nick, I know you want me to go to 690, but I think I need to be in 610 now. So could you consider leaving, not transferring me to 690, but leaving me in 610? And he didn't answer me, but he said he would think about it. And eventually he said, yeah, I think that's the right thing to do at this time. Franco retired from NASA in January of 2010, and I was on base for the 6 months it took to hire his replacement, which was Peter Hildebrand. One of the other things I did in my spare time with the center was for years I was on the performance evaluation board for the Goddard Library. And I helped to rescue the library 3 times over the period of about 5 years. And the reason is the following. The issue with the library is the library, for those of you that know that center maintenance and operational money comes from headquarters, and it's a very limited pot, and it gets more limited every year. And that's where the library was funded. But nobody in 200 who administers CM&O uses the library. Typically, they don't use it. The people that use it are sitting in this room, the scientists, some of the engineers, but overwhelmingly the scientists. So the people that lay out the money are not the ones using it. So every once in a while, they try to kill it. So I'd pick up my spear and get my helmet and go out and let's defend the library. Well, when Center Director Rob Strain came in, he was determined to kill the library. He was like, we don't need a library. You can use the internet. You can use all the other stuff. You know, we got friends at the universities. You can use their stuff. What he didn't know was that one of the reasons we could use the University of Maryland stuff was they had agreements to use our stuff. And there's this tremendous IT infrastructure, sort of like what sits behind Amazon to make it so easy to shop, that nobody ever sees. It just works. And so our people in the library, we had a whole cadre of IT people working on the library staff to make sure that they were obeying the rules from the journals, that they weren't violating any contracts, and so that we were getting what we needed. At one point, we were sitting in a meeting, and he says, we're going to kill the library. He says, at least it's just going to be the size of a closet. And I just looked at him. I said, we cannot kill the library. This is a research center. I thought he was going to fire me. I thought he was going to fire me right then and there, because the look he gave me was not nice. And so I thought, well, I don't know. So he didn't fire me. He probably forgot. And, but he left. And so then we went and redesigned the library, and that's what we have now, the new center where we can do collaborative work, and we still have our stacks and some of the books. Peter Hildebrand was selected in July of 2010. He and I worked together well. He was very different from Franco, a very different type of boss, much more less structured. And when we had a 16-day furlough in 2013, I still can see him coming out of his office and looking at Lori and saying, I'm done. I'm not going through another one of these again. And in April of 14, he retired. So then we come to Piers. Piers was the deputy director of 600 for a while, and also the acting director of 610 from 2014 to 2016. But he wanted a scientist as his deputy. So I helped him find a scientist as his deputy. I served on the search committee, and then I became the associate, which was a trend then. Many years ago, it was scientist at the top and an engineer deputy. Now it's scientist. Piers was a trip to work for. I mean, I know a lot of you knew him, but he was a real trip to work for. He was brilliant, energetic, gregarious, loved parties. If you had a meeting, you had to have a party. With his astronaut calling card, golden astronaut calling card, which I used to call it. And the first time I called it that, he looked at me like I was crazy. I said, Piers, you can talk to anybody. You can talk to anybody. All you got to do is say who you are. You can talk to anybody. And so he was one of the best ambassadors for Earth that you could possibly work for. And I used to say I think this was probably what working for a rock star feels like. After Piers passed away, Jim was chosen as the head of 600, which he is today, and I see he made it. So I served as the associate until March of this year, where I retired to help care for my mom, who is in assisted living. Thanks to Jim's sponsorship, I now serve on the Scientific Colloquium Committee. I'm Emeritus, which is something I've wanted to do with the Colloquium Committee for years, but just never had the time to do it. I'm still involved in D&I, as you can see. In late October, I was invited to participate in the pilot for diversity and inclusion gender, which was very interesting, and I submitted my comments to Dan to make that a regular presentation that we have. This was the first one. So a couple of people, Sharon Wong was invited, a couple of people from previous years were invited to add our input to make this another very, very good training class. I continue to serve as an internal mentor and coach, and I'm in office C420 in this building. I can see the earth, I can see the sky, I can see the trees, and I can now see the water. And what am I doing? This is what my daughter and I, it's us on the top picture, her on the right, and me on the left. We skate, and so I expect to be doing more skating. I do Canine Freestyle with my dog, and if you don't know what Canine Freestyle is, it's doing routines to music with your dog, doing different elements, like circles around you, healing, tricks, things like that. It's a blast. It's definitely one of the craziest things I've ever done. But the dog picked it. He's a very smart dog. He's a Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever, and he needed a hobby, so this is his hobby. And then skiing with family and friends. We still like to ski. We're all fortunately healthy enough to still do that. And then traveling with family and friends. And we just got back from the Galapagos, which I wanted to go to. It was on my bucket list, and I picked Jim's brain about it because he had gone fairly recently. And Machu Picchu, and then we have some other trips. And when we came back, that was a demanding trip. And when we went with our brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and when we finished the trip, we all looked at one another and said, we got to put all the hard trips first. So I still, even as an emeritus, I have some goals for NASA. I'd still like us to be a really good place to work where everybody's voice is heard. I'd like to create a learning organization so that we're learning rather than accusing each other of making mistakes. And protect the data. The earth science data that we have is more important now than it ever was. One of the things Jerry Soffin, who was the original project scientist for EOS, told me was you got to protect the data. And as I've gone through this whole process many decades, I now know what he said. I now appreciate even more what he said, because that data is golden. Those are the pearls of our work, and we got to make sure it's not corrupted, lost, or damaged in any way. And then, as Charles said, there's probably going to be a break in these Maniac talks after, is it Colleen in March? Is that right? No.
There's one coming up in July.
One in July. So if this is helpful, has been helpful to you, or if you found it helpful to somebody in your organization, please let the 610 leadership know that. And thank you for coming.